In this episode, we discuss the book Homo Criminalis and take a look at how consistently throughout recorded history, the criminal underworld and the general overworld have kind of danced in sync with one another. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man whose podcast takes can take you on a funky ride. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show the people how to get up and get out?
Yeah, I think we're going to go on a fantastic voyage today, right?
Hey, man, you tell me, man.
Well, I just want to see if you'd laugh, if you get
it. All right. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you subscribe or like the show on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. We're recording on July 21st, 2026, and we continue our culture series today by doing some reading between the lines in the book Homo Criminalis, How Crime Organises the World, which was released in 2025. In this book, author Mark Galeotti does a deep dive on the criminal underworld, and with particular focus on how throughout history, crime has organized itself in ways that mirror society at large, and also how in many cases have operated to keep things moving in society at large. So to get us started, Tunde, I know you appreciate the subtitle here, how crime organizes the world. So after having read the book, what stands out to you most in the book in that concept?
Yeah, so a lot stood out, which I know we'll discuss, but the idea of organizing the world was intriguing to me. And I want to speak on that for a second because the subtitle didn't say how crime rules the world, how it runs the world, how it makes the world do this or that. It specifically, the term organizes. So that's what intrigued me at the very beginning, because I was like, wow, this is an interesting look at society. And in reading the book, which I know we'll discuss, it did a good job at that. Like, where is that line? And it seems, to the point of the way you even introduced the show, the line is blurry. And that there are times in history that we've seen where the underworld has actually kept the upper world kind of propped up. And I'll finish on this, James, and hand it back. This book was even more intriguing to me just having lived in the recent years, because, we've got things like, we just did recently a discussion on the latest financial disclosures by some of our leadership in this country. We know that there are some famous files that were released by the Department of Justice, and a lot of these things that we've been seeing,
which happen to include that same leader.
Yeah. So, but the point is just like, a lot of us, I think it's just been interesting. It's like this blurring of lines. Like, hold on, but this guy was doing this stuff, but he's also hanging with these heads of state, not just domestically, but internationally as well. And it's like, yeah. So I think that how crime organizes the world affairs is a very interesting topic. In the book, I think did a good job of maybe not explaining it all in a matter of fact way, but more helping us understand the blurriness. And how it plays out.
And the extensiveness of it. Like, this is not something that is, this is a feature, not a bug, so to speak. And that to me was the biggest takeaway from this, is that I think a lot of times a more simplistic understanding of kind of society is that the criminal underworld, particularly, again, not smash and grab necessarily, but particularly in its more organized ways or in certain ways, is not a malfunction of the overworld, so to speak. It's not something is being done wrong in the overworld, and so therefore this crime will exist, so to speak. And again, there's certain types of crime that, yes, there are ways for regular society to combat that and to really reduce that. So there are types of crime that are a result of regular society doing something wrong. But crime itself is something that is inherent to an underworld to some degree. And it is like the book talked about concepts like, as long as there's property, there will be theft. And as long as states, can ban and tax things, there will be people trying to get around that, and the book starts talking about just banditry and how that was almost considered a respected profession, if you go back and far enough in history and so forth. So, and another one, as long as there's privilege, which human societies have privilege and privileged people, as long as there's privilege, there will be underprivileged, and underprivileged will be drawn to illicit activities more so because the legitimate opportunities are going to be denied to them more so. So it's almost like these normal human things that we think about, the normal ways, the normal outcomes of ways that we organize ourselves give rise to lots of types of what we consider crime, so to speak. So the way that I mentioned at the beginning, it's like this dance that's being done. And at its core level, it's easy to see that. If you're like, okay, prohibition, when the United States did prohibition, then organized crime spiked because they were given this marketplace. But again, that goes back to as long as states ban and tax type of thing. So that spiked it. That may have been an overreach by the state if you spike organized crime in that way by banning something, or as opposed to finding other ways to minimize it or control it. But nonetheless, the existence itself, organized crime existed prior to that. That was just something giving them a bone that allowed them to kind of spin out of control a little bit more, So yeah, I think that just the hand-to-hand piece, or the yin and yang was the example I kind of gave to you, is like, it seems like these things operate, there is a symmetry, to the way that they operate in societies. And what that means, though, is that if you want to reduce crime, there are other ways to go about it, as opposed to it shouldn't necessarily be all stick. There should be other ways how you organize society, in some ways give rises to more crime or can lessen the amount of crime that exists, particularly, like I said, in that organized fashion.
Yeah, man, I think it's fascinating. And, as you're talking, it makes me realize that you're talking about things like prohibition. Remember, we recently did the show on the five families, the American Italian mafia. And so, remember, in that discussion, we talked about how once by the mid 1930s, when the mafia was really making money and doing well with, like you said, filling the need that prohibition created, that people still wanted to drink alcohol. So, somebody's going to sell it. Then he said, okay, well, let's mirror the upper world then. And he went to the Italian families and said, we're going to make more money if we can figure out how to stop fighting each other and bring these five families together and create a cartel, basically.
Yeah, that was the Luciano story.
Yeah, so it was luckily Luciano. Sorry. So it's interesting how that was an example of how the underworld took cues from the upper world or overworld and said, hey, we can behave like them and create a corporate structure for us down here.
Yeah,
and it worked. And to your point, that's why it made me think of it, is Italian and Americans at the time in the early 20th century were discriminated against and couldn't find employment in other areas of society because, a lot of people didn't want Italians assimilating into greater mainstream America. So it's like you said, I guess that might be a better way for me to
remember, and that was one of the things even in the Five Families documentary that they talked about, is that over time, as Italians were more accepted in society, the opportunity, the mob receded some. There were people would go, and again, as Italians became less underprivileged, then more of them opted to join the overworld, so to speak, and they didn't have to behave. They weren't being shunned and denied the privileges, and so therefore they took advantage of the overworld, so to speak. So again, in that same kind of way.
Yeah, no, you're right. And in other groups, people don't realize this, in the early 20th century, there was a lot of really rough Jewish gangs running around the Northeast and all that. And,
for the same reason.
Yeah, for the same reason. We know the story of black gangsters in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So the idea is, yes, if you keep a certain group of people out of mainstream society, they're going to do whatever they can to still make it. And usually that's providing goods and services that are banned in mainstream society, but that mainstream society still wants.
Yeah.
And in our society, that's been traditionally drugs, alcohol during prohibition, and sex, things like that, prostitution, all that.
Yeah, I'd say I think we've seen that, and I think a lot of people appreciate that. Just that. But I think it's worth being said because, again, I'm talking about this dance between the overworld and the underworld.
Yeah.
The underworld doesn't need Madison Avenue out there marketing what it has. They're like, hey, we're going to make people, Madison Avenue is like, hey, we how can we get people to want to buy more clothes? People have clothes. They don't necessarily need more clothes. How can we get them to want to buy more clothes? That's how the overworld thinks. The underworld is like, hey, we'll just wait. People want certain things. We'll wait until the state decides that they can't have them or taxes them so much that they won't be able to reasonably get them. And then we just step in there, So it's like the demand for the stuff that the underworld does, oftentimes criminal, the organized underworld is created by the upper world, so to speak. But the other thing I wanted to touch on with you within this that I found that really, really, really was interesting and stood out to me was the discussion on how similar governments are, or the way the state operates, and criminal protection rackets. And just going in I think the chapter was near the beginning. It was like looking at protection versus extortion, so to speak. So, what did you make of this chapter, and then just areas of the book that kind of touched on how closely related or how similar the action of a government would be to, at its core, a protection racket? Like, hey, I won't, rob your store. You pay me off, and in fact, if you pay me off, I won't rob your store, and I'll stop these other guys from robbing your store. That gets into some of the what we traditionally see a state doing.
Yeah, no, so again, those kind of concepts were fascinating to me, because once you hear it, your brain can make the connection. But until I was reading it in this book, I never really thought of that. And there's a quote I'm going to read from the book. And it says, a quote, "Yesterday's predator becomes tomorrow's legitimate protector."
Yeah.
And that was the part, because you were talking about banditry, and they talked about that in early modern Europe, and coming out of kind of the medieval period and all that. Banditry was what happened like in the countryside, and a lot of the, where there was lawlessness, the bandits were the main guys. But it's somehow over time, as modern Europe developed, a lot of those bandits ended up becoming governors of lords of the little fiefdoms. The regional areas they were
protectors.
At, because
they became protectors of that area. Yeah.
And they were kind of the middlemen. They became the protectors for those people, but they also were kind of respected by whoever the lord or the nobility was, because it was like, all right, well, if that guy can keep that set of people, that 10,000 people over there in that valley calm, and he can control them, then I'll just deal with him. So eventually the guy that was practicing predation on a population became the one that ruled it. And it's kind of fascinating. And so one of the examples they give that I thought was very interesting, and I'll just cite a little bit from here, was how the British Empire fought the 2 wars with China in the 19th century over opium. And I knew about those stories, but they get into a little bit more detail how the British had outlawed opium in Britain. So British people weren't allowed to use opium as a drug because it was seen as negative and would put society in a bad place. But the British Empire, because of the British East India Company and its monopoly, still wanted to sell opium and make money doing it, selling it to other places. So they didn't care if the Chinese community collapsed because they were all addicted to opium. But the Chinese did care about that. So the Chinese themselves, as a sovereign nation, state, said, we don't want to buy any more opium, when they banned imports. So to deal with that, the British sent their navy and started, shelling and bombing the coast of Beijing and Shanghai, and forced
they would open their ports to allow the import of opium.
Force the Chinese to have to do that, and to have to basically bring opium in, which ruined China for almost a century, which created Mao, right, as a response. So these things have long tailwinds. And I thought about that, James. I thought about, yes, in one way, the British government, the British crown, was being a government on its own people and telling them, we don't want you doing this because we think it's going to hurt society. And in the other way, they're extorting the Chinese population and basically putting a gun to their head, literally, and saying, you better take this drug, which we know is going to ruin your population, because we just want to make profit. And, I couldn't help but think, James, about Afghanistan and the fact that we just spent 21 years there as a nation. Everybody knows Afghanistan produces 90% of the world's poppy, which is the root ingredient for opioids and heroin. And somehow in the same period of time that we occupy that country with the greatest military ever, and could stop all of that stuff exporting, at the same time, we have an opioid epidemic in the United States. And that's what got me thinking about somebody who was in the state level also made a decision to make sure that we didn't destroy the poppy and eradicate this stuff around the world. And, that to me is where all this stuff kind of gets blurry.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one example of where it gets blurry. I mean, I think that taking a step back, which the author does, he talks about like that a state itself must, establish its authority to provide protection and to adjudicate disputes. Kind of the core functions of what can define a state. You establish protection or provide protection for the people that are under your guise, and then the ability to adjudicate disputes. When somebody has a problem with somebody else, here's how it's going to be resolved. And it does so, part of the function of the state, it would be to exclude others from providing those things as well. And so when you look at it at that core level, then it makes sense that whether it be a state that considers itself to be a legitimate, well, like you said, that line is blurry, but considers itself to be a legitimate sovereign or entity, can handle that stuff. But the thing is that if the state doesn't provide that stuff, and this is again where you have this dance between the overworld and the underworld, in places where the state chooses not to or cannot provide protection and adjudicate disputes, a power will arise there to do those things typically, and that will be usually considered a criminal organization, so to speak, at a lot of times. And so what ends up happening in that sense is that, I mean, I know when we did the Five Families, part of what the mafia was doing in a lot of the neighborhoods was providing protection for people, and whether it's from themselves or from other gangs, and then being a place where you go to the Godfather, you got this dispute with this other business or whatever, he can mediate that dispute. So, and those are places where people couldn't or didn't trust the regular authorities to do that kind of stuff, So if what they're doing is the same in some cases, then it makes sense that the lines between them would be blurry. A lot of it comes down to, when you talk about adjudicating disputes, that means, hey, all right, here's what's going to happen. Here's the resolution. Everybody abide by this. You can only do that if people say, hey, if I don't do what this person says, I'm going to have a problem. So a certain level of power there. And then same thing with providing protection. You have to have a certain level of power. A lot of this comes down to having sufficient power in the eyes of people, and as a matter of fact, to tell other people what to do. And that's something that a government would have in common with a criminal organization. So when you boil it down like that, then yes, they in many ways are kind of the same. Now, I think there's been an advent in more recent times that will put some distance between, or that can put some distance between a criminal organization and a government. And that would be what I would consider that to be rule of law. Like rule of law, actually, if you're going to set one set of rules and then everybody abides by that, and you don't have exceptions for this person or that person or anything like that just because of arbitrary stuff, then you actually can divorce it just from, hey, I'm a body that throws my force around, throws my power around. You're actually you're serving something a little higher, but that's the exception in human societies. Usually it's just, hey, I have the most power, so I'm going to call the shots. And I might have gotten the most power through illicit means. But once I get it, I'll come up with a backstory of why it's okay for me to have it. And then I move forward from there, which is, it's something we've seen throughout history, and also illustrates what you just talked about, how the people who were the bandits, in many cases, oftentimes end up becoming the people who are providing the protection and agents of the state in that area.
So it's funny. You landed in the perfect area where I can quote the book, because this is one of my highlights. It says, in this respect, if history is written by the victors, then crime is the complaint of the loser, but defined by the winner.
I remember that part. That was good.
Yeah, it's good, but it's true, right? Like, yeah. If history is written by the winner, then the person that says that you're a criminal is the loser. It's because what is crime and what is not crime is defined by the winner. And we've seen that throughout history. I mean, there was a time when slavery was legal in the world, and now it's not. And I'm not just talking about the African slave trade. I'm talking about all slavery. And the last country to ban slavery was Madagascar in 1981. And that's 1981. And so there was a time when owning other human beings and telling them that they had to do stuff you wanted them to do, and they didn't have any agency for themselves, was legal. And today it's not. Well, and maybe one day it'll be legal again. You gave an
example earlier, though, just with the British East India Company, like where if they would have tried to import heroin or opium into ports in England, it would have been a criminal act. And if they would have done it, and then, but the same country would go to war with China to make sure that they could import it into China. So it's literally just that's arbitrary though. That's where you are operating more like a criminal organization than a quote unquote government, at least in terms of the impression that people have when they think of, or many people do think of the government as just as corrupt.
Let me ask you a question, James.
Yeah.
Because in the real world, I mean, we're in 2026, January 3rd, 2 days into the new year, we basically saw the United States kidnap the leader of Venezuela.
Yeah.
And the president of the United States basically come to a press conference a day later and say, we went there to get the oil, and a lot of our companies made capital investments like Chevron, and they deserve to go back and see their investment play out. I mean, so it's fascinating. That's basically the same thing.
I think we wouldn't have enough time to give all the examples of governments acting like criminal organizations. And I mean, that's kind of the point, is that this isn't a recent phenomenon. This has been this kind of back and forth, or you're acting like a what people consider, again, because it's all about impressions, really. What people consider a government a lot of times has more upstanding. But you go in many places of the world, like when we did, like we've looked at books talking about how, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, for example, and the things that were being described in that book that were being done by either agents of the United States or of corporate entities in the United States, it was all criminal conduct, depending on the context that it's done. But criminal conduct is not supposed to depend on the context on what it's done and who it's being done to. But that's just that's in many cases, that is the kind of the blurriness that you talk about. I do want to keep us moving, man. The book gave a lot of historical background. Like it was the word I used with you when I was like, man, like, what are we going to talk about? I was like, man, this book is cumulative. Like it gives example after example, smuggling, counterfeiting, like all of these different things and how they interplay with, how they this line between legitimate and illegitimate quote unquote actors is people are on both sides doing the same kind of stuff. And then also though, how the people that are on one side of that line actually still play a big role in how societies operate and unfold. But with all this historical background on various forms of organized crime in society, was there anything that it talked about relating to maybe organized crime more recently, that you took note of or that you found to be pretty interesting?
Yeah, so there was a few, and I'm looking in the book now because there were some good examples, like someone like Pablo Escobar. They said, the famous cocaine dealer from the 90s that we grew up, knowing his name, that he had built schools, public, hospitals and things like that in his area of Medellin, Colombia. Talked about the Russians and the transition from the Soviet state to kind of modern Russia today. And in the 90s, the kind of blurring of the lines between the Russian gangsters and those who became, influential in the Russian government. So there was a lot of those type of examples.
The gangsters became industrialists. Because they were the only ones, but they were the only ones who wielded sufficient power to say, hey, if you make this deal with me, you better come through with what you promised. Because, but go ahead. Yeah.
James, but also I think you made a great point, and I just to allude to that real quick, and then I'll continue my thought, was because as you were talking in that last bit, it made me think of specifically the movie The Godfather Part 2 and Robert De Niro's character when Vito Corleone was young, and they showed him that he became the Godfather by just solving disputes.
Yeah.
He wasn't out there shooting people and all that at the beginning. It was about him being the trusted guy and all that stuff. And so
but
that
also
to me
with
was
the power
interesting
to make people adhere to what he said, though. Like the threat did exist. Like, hey,
because remember in the film, he did take out that big dog dude that showed everybody in the block that he's the man. So you're right about that. And I think that to me was an example specifically of where you're going with the Russian situation in the 90s, which was the Russian gangsters also had the ability to solve disputes because they were used to dealing with the public in certain ways, in certain sectors of the economy, and also the government. So I found that very interesting.
Just for the context for the audience, this is in the period post-Soviet breakup, where the economy and the government are all trying to reorganize themselves, but people's lives go on and business still happens and so forth. And so during that time period, this is who are going to be the new winners and losers when you have all these cards and the whole deck gets thrown up. How are these things going to get picked up and organized moving forward? And like the book talked about that, and as far as how the people who were part of the organized crime actually had a head start in terms of being able to try to put things back together, like you said, because they were already there with the power and the ability to adjudicate disputes.
Yep. And by the way, I just want to say, I appreciate doing the show with an attorney, because that word adjudicate I don't hear that from anyone else. It's got to be in your profession. But to continue on is, so the story that really stood out to me was one that I think many of us, I think all of us listening, because I think everyone listening to us is over 20 years old, would have experienced, which is the great financial crisis of 2008 through kind of 2010 period. And in 2009, there was a person, her name was Antonia Maria Costa, who was the head of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And I'll quote her. She said that, quote, "It was criminal funds that stopped the global financial system from grinding to a halt during the 2008 financial crisis." And that really intrigued me, because I thought, especially as a guy that does what I do for a living, I do financial planning. I'm involved with the capital markets all the time and banking stuff. And I've never heard of that. And so I'll just, yes, like that wasn't in the Bloomberg terminal.
You always were throwing out quantitative easing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They didn't tell me that on CNBC when I was watching, back during the height of the crisis. So, I'll read here real quick because it's a good quote. The lady says, so, quote, "Their dirty money was the only liquid investment capital available to many financial institutions tottering on the edge of collapse." And quote, the system was basically paralyzed because of the unwillingness of banks to lend money to one another. And I was like, yeah, I remember that. But a number of institutions were rescued by interbank loans funded by money that originated from the drug trade and other illegal activities. In the process, most of some $352 billion in profits from the narcotics trade alone was absorbed into the economic system. The underworld laundered its cash on a gargantuan scale. The upper world got through the crisis. That to me was fascinating, man, because think about it, $352 billion back then. I mean, that's a lot of money right now, but with the inflation we've had since the pandemic, that was probably, you could say, almost worth $1 trillion worth of money back then. In today's dollars. And then the other one that says on narcotics alone. So we're not including human trafficking, gun running, all the other illicit things that, can build the coffers of gangsters. And that to me, James, was a very interesting revelation that the system may have actually collapsed if it wasn't for the banks turning the cash of the drug dealers and the cartels and the illicit money into loans that they could then be confident another bank could say, "Oh, I see you've collateralized this loan now with this cash. I'll do business with you." That's pretty fascinating.
Well, it's the grease, so to speak, because also what was talked about is how, yes, the governments poured trillions of dollars, but that a lot of times went to the bigger banks, But what about all these mid-tier players, smaller
those
players?
Private equity lines of credit,
And those mid-tier players were not getting bailed out by governments or anything like that. And so, you put in $1/3 of $1 trillion in cash, into these places, and you float a lot, so to speak. And I think that it's important to realize, though, this wasn't done out of the graciousness of people's heart. Like, the organized crime, as it's discussed in the book, is always looking for ways to clean their money, to launder their money. We got all this money. The bigger problem isn't getting the money. The problem is getting the money clean, getting the money so that I can use it in places, getting it into the government financial or the legitimate financial system, and not just having it sitting around in cash at home, or in some safe somewhere, or some mini safe somewhere. Like, so this was a boon for them as well. Like, this was, and a lot of times, like laundering money, you don't get to keep all of the money. You don't put in 100 and get 100 back, so to speak. So being able to do this and the value proposition being much better for them, it was something. It was, truly a win-win, so to speak. But the thing that stuck out to me about this is just the scale. If that's just what got laundered that they know about at that moment, because it's just what they know about, it's going to be more, and like just how big a business we're talking about here. Because
listen, man,
like that's just the stuff that we know about that got laundered at that moment. But this is stuff that's happening all the time.
So those files that were released by the Department of Justice, remember, before 2019, JP Morgan said that gentleman's one bank account had $4.3 million of fraud that they identified.
Yeah.
After he was imprisoned again, but before he died in prison, they corrected themselves, I guess, because he was back in jail and they had the spotlight on them. And they said, "Oh, we made a mistake. Now we actually come back. It's $1.2 billion in fraudulent transactions that we flagged in one account."
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying is that's why to me this book was so interesting in the era we're living in, with all these realities being uncovered about, and then that same guy was threatening Bill Gates with an email, because of his affair, and he's hanging out with presidents, and so it's like, all right, so this guy clearly was operating in a criminal way in many ways that we've all been privy to, but then he's also in proximity to the most powerful people that run our world, and his girlfriend, who was doing his crimes with him, was invited to the wedding of the former, president and former first lady in 2010, the daughter's wedding. So this is like, the lines being blurry is not a joke. You know what I mean? I mean, this is real stuff. And so, and to this day,
I know for you, because you were much more interested in following, the things, the contents of those files, and that was the thing you always said to me, was just like to see all of the connections between the overworld. And this is before we read this book. You were just like, yo, it's just fascinating to see all the money.
That's what got me fascinated about the book.
All the money and all the connections that are made between these people that are, like on one side of the line and these people that are on the other side of the line. And then also how people seem to jump back and forth on which side of the line they're on. At least some people, not everybody, but so it's but dirty game.
I want to say this real quick. Based on what you were just saying, James, I was going to make a joke, especially with what I do for a living. I was going to say, so you're telling me now that I got to go talk to the family office of Pablo Escobar. They're basically like, when you're talking about, because I could see that these guys are so wealthy that they have chief investment officers also, right? And they do make these capital investments into legitimate businesses, and they buy real estate and all that. So again, money being fungible, it just kind of goes back into the system, and it allows the underworld and the overworld to they're symbiotic. And I think that what I learned in reading this book and thinking about it and having this kind of, conversations in private like we're having here on the show is it's really amazing how I guess it's like the Matrix made it. It's all happening in front of us, but because of the way our culture is and the kind of we've been talking about, like you said, about those files, the way we look at people, we recognize the behavior of some and not the behavior of others. And that's based on how we're kind of programmed culturally. And I just find that all interesting. Which is why,
well, I have a phrase for that, because and this isn't 100%. There are plenty of people that still do try to be principled on things, but a lot of people in our society are really playing the game or are played by the game of heroes and villains. And that's it. It's all about who's my hero, who's my villain. And then once you decide that, your brain does the rest, so to speak. These cognitive biases that exist that will orient your brain in certain ways. Once you decide that so-and-so is my hero, then your brain will notice every place that you could potentially exalt him, and your brain will unconsciously disregard the places that you probably should question that person a little bit. I think that along this line, the piece that I think can't be lost. The book said something that I found to be just very, very interesting on corruption. And he talked about how the point of corruption is monetizing privilege. And so if you look at it in that frame, then all of the stuff we're talking about makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of the quote unquote legitimate actors. The legitimate actors, but I say quote unquote the legitimate actors though, because clearly they're dancing on this line back and forth. Because if you're not going to monetize, if you're a government official, you have a certain level of privilege. Then if you're going to behave honorably, then you aren't going to take bribes and all that kind of stuff, because you're not trying to monetize that privilege. But as soon as you put people in power that see that power, that privilege as an opportunity to make money, more money, then that's where you get the corruption. And that's the corruption that we see. That's the corruption that was taken as part and parcel in certain parts of the world, whether it be Russia or something like that. Like, oh yeah, that's just what's happening there. And in many respects, that's what we see. That's why there was an emollients clause in our U.S. Constitution, and you can see people now that ignore that. That say, hey, we want to monetize our privilege. We're going to ignore the emollients clause and not force people to not monetize their privilege. Another place you can see this, and maybe this is why the emollients clause gets ignored, is because in Congress, they want to monetize their privilege. They're privy to information beforehand, and then they trade stocks on that type of stuff. And so they're monetizing their privilege. All this rampant corruption. And ultimately, in a government like ours, we can't just say that these people are just doing it to us, because we apparently keep voting for people that have demonstrated a level of corruption, that they will take the power that they get and monetize it. And that is the corruption. The corruption is monetizing the privilege and the power that they've been given by us, the people. So to me, one of the takeaways here is that a lot of this stuff ultimately comes down to, and it comes down to what the society expects of themselves and is willing to accept. Whether it be the criminal organizations, whether it be the quote unquote legitimate organizations. The legitimate organizations will lean into the criminality stuff if needs be. We have corporations that, do terrible things. They're trying to, internalize their profits, externalize their costs, and doing things that in some contexts would be considered criminal as well. So what are we going to put up with, as people, as long as we have a government that's supposed to be responsive to us?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? That's what people will figure out at the next election, what they're going to put up with. I'm done trying to figure that out. But I will say this. No, you bring up an interesting point. Just as
let's wrap.
With Congress, because I mean that's why I want to focus on that for a minute here. You're right that Congress has access to information that the public doesn't have, and they're allowed to trade stocks on that. One president in my lifetime tried to deal with that, and his name was Barack Obama, and everyone hated him, so I guess he wasn't able to do it. He was seen as a commie when he proposed that, and now everyone hates that Congress does that. But this is how interesting of a time.
But that's that heroes and villains thing. Some people had decided he was a villain. So if he tries to do something, I know they're just
we can keep it moving. Yeah, I don't want to get focused on that. I just think I just said it just to say it, but you're right. But the point is that insider trading is against the law. They're obviously have inside information because they're talking to corporations, is legislating on what these corporations are telling them they want to do and all this. So clearly they should not be trading these stocks. But think about this, James. I brought this to your attention a few months ago. There are 2 ETFs that all of us in the public can go buy. I'm not here selling these ETFs, but just to mention, one is the symbol is NANC, Nance, and the other one is titled GOP. And the Nance gives you the stock picks of the Democrats in Congress, and the GOP one gives you the stock picks of the Republicans in Congress. So my point is that we're not allowed to do insider trading as the public, but we're allowed to be passive investors on the corruption of the insiders in the government. Think about that.
Yeah.
Think about how crazy that is just as a society that we say we can. That's like if I could go buy drugs passively, right? Like I could just go buy some cocaine, or invest in it, but it's illegal. And, it's just weird. So anyway, I don't know. That's to me like this weird thing where it's like,
it's weird.
Corruption is now available in my IRA. I can just buy the ETF. You know what I mean?
And maybe the point of that is further desensitize people to it, because that's the thing that's been so jarring to me is that I thought that generally speaking, people agreed that corruption was bad. And I see that that's not really the case, that a lot of people view corruption and in the light of who's doing it, and then you're in a bad.
I think you're right.
Yeah. But the point to tie that back to the book, though, that is also apparently how a lot of times crime is viewed. Is a matter of who's doing it, but that's not. We've looked at it a lot of time, or a lot of people. I've looked at it as being more of a modern phenomenon. What this book made pretty clear is that. That's been pretty consistent. As long as
it's a human phenomenon.
Like the who's the criminal and who's the statesman. That's been fuzzy for a long time. So but no, it was a really good book. We definitely would recommend checking it out if that's the kind of topic that that intrigues you. So we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode of Call Like I See It. Subscribe to the podcast, rate it, review it, tell us what you think, send it to a friend. Until next time, I'm James Keys.
I am Tunde Ogunlana. Please give us a comment and a like, as James said.
All right. We'll talk soon.